So, in our inaugural episode of IoT and AI Leaders, I've got an old friend of mine, Rob Tiffany. You'll hear Rob describe his background, and it is very varied, as is this podcast. We cover a lot of ground on AI and the positive side of it, the abundance message, and the negative side of it, which is the what could go wrong and what we need to be aware of. Rob has a lot of information from his new role as a research director in IDC and talks about what he's seeing from large companies and the role. We finish off by talking about the role of the IoT project manager and how it's going to get more and more important as companies build the enterprise brain, as IDC are now talking about it. It's a fantastic episode to kick off the new podcast around the convergence of IoT and AI, and I hope you really enjoy it. Here it is. So before we get started, this is actually a really important episode because for the last 4 years, we've been doing IoT leaders, and then it became really clear that suddenly the data from IoT is going to be really essential for AI going forward. And some people would say, including potentially my guest this week, that it will actually be more important than the data that's been collected by AI so far. So we're rebranding as IoT and AI leaders. We hope to get another 4 years worth of podcasts out of this. And my guest this week is Rob Tiffany. And Rob and I have known each other for many years, and we've done a variety of podcasts, some of which we were just talking prior to recording this. Perhaps we want to forget, but hopefully not this one. We're hoping this one is one we want to remember. And so with that, Rob, welcome to what I now need to call the IoT and AI Leaders Podcast.
Excellent. Thanks so much for having me. It's great to be here.
Great. And, as I said, we do know each other a while. And because of that, I can actually intro this by saying you have a really interesting background. I mean, everyone has an interesting background, but you have a really interesting background. And it actually starts with a submarine. And maybe we could pick up from there and maybe you just introduce yourself that way.
Yes. I'm still in the Navy driving submarines. No, you're right. That it is kind of unusual. It was a lifetime ago that in the U.S. Navy, and I was on a couple of submarines. The first one was a SEAL team delivery vehicle. So basically they took some of the old ballistic missile subs from the 60s, took out the ICBMs, or they call them SLBMs on a submarine, to have berthing space for the Navy SEALs. And then on the top flat missile deck, they put the shelter and they had 2 mini subs. And so total James Bond kind of stuff. It was really cool. And so did that special ops kind of stuff. And then I was on a Trident submarine, and you have Trident submarines as well in the UK.
We do.
The name Trident comes from the missile, actually. And so in the US, they were called Ohio class submarines. And so not quite as interesting. You're just kind of cruising around really slow, waiting for the message from the president.
Right.
So yeah, kind of creepy.
And you need to make sure you've not got the Navy SEALs loaded in the tubes.
Exactly. But a lot of people are like, I grew up in Texas, and they're like, how in the world did you get to the Pacific Northwest and end up at Microsoft and all those places? And literally, I arrived there via submarine and opened a hatch. Here I am, because we decommissioned all our nuclear submarines at the shipyard that's across the Puget Sound kind of bay from downtown Seattle. And so there you have it. That's how I got to the Northwest, just in time for the grunge era to happen in the early 90s. So I really scored on that one.
So we've already covered potentially 4 podcasts worth of subjects, but we'll narrow it back down to IoT and AI because, maybe you could just give a quick thumbnail sketch, because I also know you were Ericsson, you've done but you mentioned Microsoft, you've done a bunch of things, and now you've got a fancy schmancy title at IDC, the analyst. So maybe you could just, the listeners and indeed the viewers who see you in that very nice red sweatshirt that you've got on, a quick thumbnail sketch of life since submarines.
Life since submarines. Lately, in addition to being an analyst at IDC, covering mostly cloud stuff, I do 3 times a year go brief senior officers in the U.S. military, like generals and admirals. I always bring back this IoT thing because it started for me in submarines, because submarines, there's no windows. And we use a variety of sensors to tell us our situational awareness. Where are you underwater? How fast are you going? Are there contacts and everything? And lots of things keep us alive on that submarine. And it's all based on sensors. And I think that was my first introduction to what would become this IoT thing, was this notion of how vital radiation sensors, different gas sensors, all kinds of things. And so, yeah, it was there. But I got out of the Navy and I joined a startup in Bellevue, Washington called Real Time Data. And that was in 1994, which means I'm older than dirt. And so that's where we kind of dove into, and it was based on vending machines. And so we took, back then there were no intelligent vending machines. You couldn't swipe a credit card. You couldn't do anything high tech. They were dumb, mechanical, put in your quarter, and they kind of had spirals that would push out your candy bars. And sometimes they get stuck. Exactly.
Yeah.
And so we had to make dumb vending machines smart, and we used cables inside there. But to do IoT in 1994, so it was just right after the internet was released to the public. It was ARPANET before that, and it was a DARPA project for the Department of Defense. And so they finally released it for commercial users, and then you saw the explosion of the World Wide Web, thanks to our good friend down at CERN. And so we started doing that, and we made dumb machines smart. And so I spent time doing there. That's where we got IoT kicked off, and we could dive into that a little more later. After that, I kind of jumped into the whole smartphone revolution because we were obviously heavily involved in early mobile operators back then, primitive days for cellular. It was pretty bad. And so I was at Microsoft and doing Windows Mobile. And so I was part of that team that launched our smartphone. It derived from the Pocket PC, which was competing against the Palm Pilot. Then we had Windows Mobile and smartphone, and then Windows Phone. And so, things were better for us when it was just us competing against BlackBerry. But as soon as the iPhone came along, you had to really get some thick skin to deal with that. And so that's probably my first half of Microsoft. Second half was designing and building different parts of the Azure cloud, which was a lot of fun, and had lots of stuff around data sync and things like that. And then finished up there designing parts of Azure IoT and deploying that system around the world. And so that was a lot of fun. Got recruited by Hitachi out of that team because I think Hitachi was looking at what GE was doing with Predix, and, Hitachi, kind of like a big industrial conglomerate, kind of like Siemens and others. And they wanted that same thing. And all they had was a name called Lumada. And so I thought they had more, but I got recruited out there to come in there and design and build an industrial IoT digital twin platform for them. And that was exciting to start.
And that recall, that was actually based around trains in one of the use cases. Is that right?
We did. Yeah. Absolutely.
Big things. Yeah.
Big things. Yeah. Because all these
submarines,
trains, giant windmills creating electricity. And so that was exciting. And as you mentioned, after that, I was at Ericsson. I went from spending my time in Japanese factories, flying to Tokyo all the time, to now I'm flying to Sweden, to Stockholm, to Kista. I was the VP and head of IoT at Ericsson. And we had something kind of similar to what you had. It was an IoT connection management platform that was connected with a bunch of mobile operators around the world. Yeah. So got to do the connectivity.
I mean, what a journey. There's so much podcast material. We're going to struggle to keep this episode short. But right now, let's bring everybody up to date. Yeah. So what are you doing now?
What am I doing right now? My day-to-day stuff is, as an analyst, I'm focused mostly, my coverage area that I'm writing about is mostly around the cloud players, public, private, hybrid clouds. You're seeing a lot of people doing multi-clouds for a variety of reasons. Sometimes it's because of M&A or something like that, which adds complexity. But it's an interesting time for the hyperscalers.
Yes.
With all this AI thing, because right now, most of I'm going to say 99% of what's happening in AI right now is happening at these large scale clouds because they're the only ones that have enough compute resources to do it. And so early on, you saw OpenAI get together with Microsoft. Anthropic has been backed this whole time by Amazon, by AWS, Google. Arguably should have been the leader the whole time. Obviously, they had DeepMind from the UK.
Yes.
And so, but I think they may have surged ahead recently with Gemini 3. That's looking pretty promising.
And that's what Sam Altman, everyone, people listening to this, and they will, if they keep up to date, they will have seen Sam Altman. I think he issued a code red.
Code red.
Code red. we're falling behind.
Yes.
I'm not sure what everybody does when a code red comes up that they weren't doing previously, because my knowledge of these companies is our daughter works for an AI company in the UK, but everybody works so hard anyway and such
Yeah.
long hours. And,
Yeah.
burnout is a real
Oh,
risk
yeah.
for everybody. So what do they then do
Because
with
it does
code
seem
red?
like I can imagine sirens going off in the
Yeah,
building and
it's
all
like
hands
an
on deck.
Elon Musk surge where it says you
Yeah.
haven't got 8 months, you've got 8 weeks, maybe
Right.
longer.
And Elon Musk is obviously another giant mega player is
Yeah,
XAI, which is really interesting, because you think about how long, obviously DeepMind's been doing it longer than anybody at Google, and they were kind of doing research quietly. The
yeah,
real takeaway with OpenAI and ChatGPT coming out 3 years ago, that originally was supposed to just be out to the public for maybe 2 or 3 weeks to just kind of show the public some of the research they were working on. I don't
right.
think they had any idea what was going to happen when people saw what it
Once they'd
did.
unleash the beast.
They unleashed a beast. And so I think it caught Google by surprise. And so,
Yeah,
because they weren't ready to really launch to the public, and then they had to, and they're scrambling. But these people have been researching and working on this forever. You have people coming out of OpenAI like Dario, who goes over to
yeah,
Anthropic. And then here's Elon, who has not, he was part of OpenAI at the beginning and then
yeah.
left.
And he split. Yeah,
And he split, and he's been focused on rocket ships to Mars and Teslas and stuff like that. What's interesting is how he started from scratch just a couple of years ago with nothing and said, I'm going to build my own competitor to these guys. And it shows how if you have unlimited money in your bank account, you can do a lot.
and again, we will bring it down to IoT, but cars and Android robots are
Right.
IoT. And his recent shareholder session, which I was just watching actually prior to this recording, where he talks about, his opening bid will be a factory in Fremont to build 1 million Android robots. He had them dancing at the event. People have seen it on YouTube. It's worth watching. But he also talks about the Tesla fully autonomous, where within 2 weeks, which I guess will be pretty soon,
Yeah.
the steering wheel will be taken out of the car and you will be able to sit and text while driving. And so,
Right.
I mean, it is all moving so fast. And that's one of the reasons why we wanted to embed more AI into IoT. And the other one actually is something that you mentioned and then passed over fairly quickly. I wanted to come back to.
Yeah.
So part of my time when I was at Cisco, I was at Cisco 14
Yeah.
years, and one of my roles was running the cloud program globally, the cloud strategy. And the reason I mentioned that is that we were always talking about 80% of the computing and the data will be stored at the edge. And you mentioned edge computing in terms of the cloud architecture,
Right.
edge computing. But I've been here almost 9 years running an IoT company, SI. But I have to say that it's still very rare for an IoT project to be truly in edge processing. Yeah, we make our own router, as you'd say over there. Be bilingual.
Which route are we going to take today?
Yeah. And, like in the Costa coffee machines we have it, and that's edge processing. But in
Right.
general, 95% of devices, or at least outside of the factory floor, are cellular devices, SIMs and whatever. So we haven't really harnessed the power of edge. At least what I'm trying to say is that I don't really think that cloud, edge computing, and AI has truly merged yet into some sort of unified architecture.
Right.
But, in chatting to you and what you're seeing at IDC, you were telling me that, no, this really is happening. It's not just a prediction about the data coming from the edge and the
Right.
factory floor and everything, but actually it is happening. And we're seeing several changes in the cloud, the hyperscalers, but also in these data centers and your concept of the enterprise brain. I mean, there's so much interesting stuff. So let's try and unpack that.
Yeah, the edge. Oh my gosh, there's so much to unpack.
So much going on at AI speed. So within
Yeah.
3 or 4 weeks time, half of this will be out of date, but let's give it a go.
Yeah,
So-
I mean, just when you talked about cellular
Yeah.
in general, because when I was back at Ericsson, I was trying to be a counterbalance, 100% a connectivity company, right? Ericsson makes cellular kit, and and I remember at the time we were launching 5G, and it was a big deal, and the whole world's going to be on 5G and IoT. And remember, we can't gloss over things. IoT has had a rough go of it. It hasn't been the smooth, wonderful path at all.
I would say 2/3 of all of the 60 episodes that we've done on the IoT Leaders podcast I quote, people must be getting fed up of me quoting it. I think I'm going to make it into a tattoo. It'd be easier.
Oh,
We predict, actually, it was Cisco, Ericsson, IBM, a bunch of
mhm,
major companies predicted in around 2010 that 50
mhm.
billion things will be connected. And we went,
Oops.
and then we looked back and said, oh my God, what did we say? Never
Got
say a
too
number and
close.
time frame in the same sentence. And we got to about 11 billion, and about 8 billion of those were Apple devices. So
Right.
yes, it was a glorious failure.
And I would be this counterbalance to the rest of the leadership team at Ericsson when it came to IoT, because in their world, it's going to be all cellular. I was like, well, actually, cellular is actually the smallest
Yeah,
segment
13%
of
of all
I,
connectivity.
most IoT actually happens indoors, which sounds strange. I'm not saying it always is going to be like that,
Like,
but when
like
we in a submarine, in buildings, in skyscrapers, in factories, all those things are indoors. And as you can imagine, and this is also a sad thing to think about, and people, it's bitten a lot of people. In my experience doing these IoT projects forever, sadly, connectivity was the last thing these teams thought about on
yeah,
their to-do list of doing the project. They were more worried about the computers and the data and analytics and all that.
yeah,
And
yeah.
they thought of connectivity as a commodity. And if
Because
it
they've been
was,
hypnotized, Rob, by the cell phone. Because
yes, they
the
have
cell
been
phone, you
hypnotized.
bought the cell phone, it had connectivity,
Right.
and it just worked.
It
And you
just
never thought
works.
about the engineering that had gone into the firmware
Yeah,
on the board and the
absolutely.
back end infrastructure. And you just had roaming, and roaming worked, and
Yeah.
you were never kicked off. You always came home after you'd been abroad, and if you were abroad, you swapped the SIM card and you carried on. The connectivity was like, well, that's the easiest part of the
That's the
project.
easiest part. And if it was indoors, a lot of people would say, well, we're just going to piggyback on the Wi-Fi that's already here.
Yeah.
And that's what they did. So it's interesting how that played out. And I'd say, well, yeah, cellular is really popular if you're outside and moving around,
Mm.
like connected cars. Ericsson had
Yeah.
a lot of connected cars, Shocker, lots of stuff with Volvo, another Swedish company.
Yeah.
We've been working with AT&T in the US for those kind of things. But indoors, it was just like, well, we'll use what we got. But then we see the advent of these little moving around robots,
Yeah.
one of those AGVs and things like that.
Yeah.
And going from access point to access point in Wi-Fi didn't work as smoothly as we'd like it to. And that's where people started going, I wonder if we should be doing cellular indoors,
Mm.
And so that came about, and that was the thing. So that's super interesting to see that evolution and people realizing how important connectivity is, because you're right, they haven't thought about it at all.
And would you say we had the guy from Volvo, French guy from Volvo on the pod about 5 episodes ago, and he was Volvo Trucks,
Mm-hmm.
and he's responsible for their strategy. And he talked about their goal. We made some sort of YouTube shorts for it, which
Right.
ton of views. But one of the quotes he talked about was trying to connect. His job description was to connect 500 million things across
Mm,
140 manufacturing lines, so that they could do predictive maintenance and the line never stopped. And that would be worth
okay.
hundreds of millions to Volvo. So to your point about indoors,
Yeah.
and of course, yes, he was using private networks and he was using LoRa and he was using a whole bunch of things. But
Mhm.
essentially, he had this goal: if you could connect everything, the original vision, back to
Mhm.
the 2010
Yes,
prediction, whoops.
that's right. The
You could
internet of
connect,
everything.
yeah, the internet of everything. What we actually got was the internet of people. But if you could connect everything, then you could optimize everything and you could make everything predictive and preemptive. And
Absolutely.
edge was always going to be, then the apps would move down to the edge, the processing would move down to the edge, and your business processes would be driven like that. And they hadn't turned out, as we know, like
Right.
that, despite the evolution of, clouds, hyperscalers, private
Yeah.
clouds. You had an interesting angle when we spoke the last time. I was asking you about these big data centers that are being built. They're modest little
Right.
affairs, like the one that's been announced, the size of Manhattan. There's a
Amazing.
small investment, six players racing against each other to control the world. But
Right.
but the idea of Nvidia selling we were talking about, is the bubble, another topical subject.
Of course
When
it
will it
is.
pop? When
When
will
will
it
it pop?
pop? Everything pops. I mean, you have a
Right.
different angle on it because you said, well, you're thinking, I'm paraphrasing, you're kind of assuming that these data centers are only going to be in the hyperscalers. But the idea of the enterprise embracing hybrid AI
Right.
data centers, maybe you could open up a little bit on that
Absolutely.
because that was interesting.
Yeah. Because you're right. Right now, it almost seems like a consumer play, which is weird. All those big players in AI, they're all in the biggest data centers, and you have a billion people maybe using an app or something to ask questions to these chatbots. But then there's this other angle, and you and I talked about this shortly after ChatGPT came out.
Yeah.
A couple of unsuspecting engineers at Samsung accidentally didn't know any better, and they uploaded a bunch of data to ChatGPT about their internal corporate information and private info, and they didn't know it was a problem. And what they didn't know is that everything you upload into ChatGPT will now become absorbed in part of a giant OpenAI LLM for the entire.
It's the matrix. You're downloading your brain
That's right. That's exactly right. So
area. Yeah.
it was kind of a oops moment there. But a lot of CEOs and a lot of the biggest companies are aware of that. And so even though a lot of the big players are saying, no, connect all your things, everything in your enterprise to our LLM, and we promise it's secure, and there's a Chinese wall or something like that, and you're going to be fine. A lot of them aren't necessarily believing that story. And so this notion of private AI running in a company's own data centers on-prem in their own co-location facility is a growing thing. Because like our numbers at IDC, 70% of corporate data is still on-prem in a data center or at edge locations or retail outlets, things like that. And so it's not all in the cloud. The cloud players want it to be, but it's not. And so there's this notion of, okay, I've got my private data. I don't want my competitors or other people to see it. I do want the value I'm seeing from these giant LLMs. I want that kind of super intelligence from my company with my specific information. And so the idea there is you can, a big company, and I think it's going to start with the largest companies. If we talk about really large, hundreds of billion parameter, open weight models. So I'm going to have the infrastructure needed, the servers, the GPUs, whether it's NVIDIA or AMD, and others. I'm going to have that infrastructure. I'm going to download a pre-trained LLM because it's funny, I was corrected. A lot of times I'll say an open source LLM. None of them are truly open source because none of them will tell you where the data came from. And some of them might be afraid to tell you where the data came from.
Yes. Well, they don't download. Some people would call it stealing, but that's another.
Stealing. Yeah, exactly. They don't want to get in trouble. So it's like, oh, here's this thing, but you can use it. And so there's different companies and different players that have some open source ones. And so you can download it. It's already pre-trained. You run it locally on your infrastructure. And then from there, you want it to be smart about your company. And so that talk around having that enterprise brain, that intelligence about your company. And so anyone who, kind of like the poor engineers at Samsung, any one of you who has ever uploaded a PDF to ChatGPT or a Word document or an Excel spreadsheet to Claude on Anthropic or whatever, and you notice that it instantly becomes an expert at all that stuff, and you can ask questions about it. In fact, we do this with IoT. When you find out a problem with the machine that's going to fail, and you go, what do I do about it? Well, I uploaded the owner's manual for that machine to ChatGPT, and now it's an expert at it. They can tell me what to do. And so doing that same thing, imagine taking every document, every database table, everything in the company and using fine-tuning to fine-tune that model with that information or RAG as well. And all of a sudden, now you've got this intelligence about everything there is to know about your company. And not just now, but in the past, everything the company ever did, it could be a 100-year-old or a 200-year-old company. We talk sometimes about company memory. I especially hear it when old timers at big companies get laid off and they go, wow, you're losing your company memory, all that tribal knowledge about what works and what doesn't. And so now you can imagine, because you always have new employees and new things happening, you can import all that stuff. And unlike just putting it into a normal database, it goes into these things called vector databases. And then all of a sudden you have this intelligence about your enterprise, and you can ask it any question and find out anything. And so new employees can learn about what happened, and they're making better decisions about business.
So let's just pause a second and recap, because there are at least 2 or 3 really big subjects that are probably worth a bit more debate that you covered. One is this issue of public-private, and are you training the world and your competitors? So the point, I think, just to recap on that, because we're moving pretty fast here. Yes, back to NVIDIA, where we started the conversation, NVIDIA and the bubble and our pensions and our everything. What you're saying is, don't just think that they're going to be selling to the data centers, but there are going to be corporate equivalents of them next to the manufacturing lines because they don't want that data to be available. The Samsung thing that you talked about, they don't want that data to be potentially available to
Right.
competitors or nation states. And maybe we'll come
Yes.
back to that as well.
Yeah.
So that's interesting because that's exactly the way cloud went. I talked about my experience with cloud. It was
Yeah.
all, we're all doomed. AWS for $6 a month, you get unlimited compute and storage and
Right.
and a Cisco router cost $18,000. So there wasn't
Right.
great ROI. But then it became hybrid and it always settled down to, as you say,
Good.
60%, 70% still stored behind the firewall. So that's number one. Then you talked about the idea of the corporate brain as a competitive advantage. So what if, again, I'm paraphrasing back to check my understanding, what if you had solved the security issue? It was behind the firewall, which you've done
Hmm.
with general cloud anyway. What if you had the 180-year history of, every document that had ever,
Hmm.
every email, every transcript, every video meeting? I mean, you won't have it back to the same extent the further you go back, but you will have billions of pieces of information behind your firewall. If you could train that, then everyone could be empowered with all the knowledge across a company. That's a very
Absolutely.
powerful idea that has been completely impossible up until now. And then the third subject you went into was this issue of when people join. I want to come back to that later on when we talk a little bit about graduate unemployment. But when
Sure.
people join, they would have access to all of that knowledge.
Right. Yeah.
So this is the glass half full scenario
Yes.
we just went
Yes.
through because that says, oh my God, companies are going to get more productive. There's an abundance of
Yeah.
intelligence. Everything, the cost of everything is going to collapse. Let's
It's
just
like
say,
we're creating the library on Trantor from the Foundation series from Asimov. The library of everything, easily accessible, in firewall, air gapped.
or the mirror, or I'll use a I'll trade you that one for a Harry Potter analogy.
Okay.
Was it called the Mirror of Erised, which was desire backwards?
Yes.
You could, if you looked into the mirror and whatever you wish for would come true. So
That's right. Harry kept
this is,
seeing his parents.
say that again.
Harry kept seeing his parents.
He did see his parents. You do have a
Yes.
wonderful habit of taking me off down a side
Oh,
street. So
sorry
I'm going
about
to come
that.
back. He did see his parents. It was it's very upsetting, very emotional.
Yes. Yes.
Anyway,
Absolutely.
so this is the sunny uplands. This is the glass half full. This is the
Uh-huh.
amazing potential. Then, of course, on the other side of it, you've got and I was watching a Stephen Bartlett Diary of a CEO episode recently. By the way, his podcasts average 2 hours 20. So you got off
Wow.
lightly by having
Oof.
me yeah. But he talked about the 6 people just in the US who are racing to build AGI.
Right.
There's no competitive pressure or regulation on any of them to slow down and put the guardrails. You mentioned briefly the
True.
security and, Dario spinning out to form Anthropic because he was concerned about security, but he's now one of the 6 racing.
Yes.
And then, of course, even if the 6 of them agreed, you could argue there's more than 6, but broadly there's 6. If the 6 of them agreed to put a framework on all of this to protect it, then what about the whole US versus China? I mean, no, China aren't going to slow down because the US.
No, they're not going to slow down.
By the way, 2 hours before recording this, I was watching the news here in the UK. Today is the day, you may be aware of this, today's the day where a country for the very first time banned social media for people under the age of 16. Australia.
Australia. That's
Because they're
wow.
concerned about there's no guardrails and there's no mental
That's right.
and the mental health for children. So
Mental health.
some countries are trying to do it, but this is a really big subject and probably for another podcast. So let me take a step back and just look at those 3 Lego bricks, if you like. You've got the fact that we kind of thought and as I said, it's changing so fast. We kind of thought that all of this would be in these huge third-party data centers, and it would be like the first instantiation of AWS. The cloud is a computer in somebody else's premise. Some people said to me.
Right.
And it's really low cost and it's amazing. And even if I don't pay, I don't pay very much. Then we started talking about the fact that these data centers will go the same way as hybrid cloud did. So 70% behind the firewall. And then you talked about the enterprise brain and the future of business processes and companies' competitiveness and knowledge will be enterprise brain, which means it has to be fed by all the data on everything, which include things.
things.
The IoT things,
Absolutely.
the data from things. How much of this is research that IDC are covering and in your role covering, or you must presumably have a series of clients. I'm not asking you to name them, but
Yeah.
everything starts typically with, as you said, with the big companies with who have the most money to experiment. Is this a thing? Do you believe there are a series of companies that are now building the enterprise behind the
They're,
firewall enterprise brain
yeah,
capability?
they may not have coalesced on all of the concepts behind it. All the big companies are definitely kicking the tires, if you will, that have big infrastructure in the same way that an individual could go to Hugging Face and download a model and try it on their laptop, a small one. As soon as a lot of, you always have a lot of CTO and all this stuff at all these big companies and their tech people. Of course, they were tasked early on. I need you to go become experts at this stuff. And then how can our company use this to empower us?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so they've all been kicking the tires. All the vendors out there. So if we know who the hyperscalers are, but then there's the traditional IT players that sell servers, Dell, Lenovo, Super Micro, HP, all those players, right? They're all working hard to empower these enterprises on-prem with liquid cooled servers,
Yeah,
including
they
the
must see it
native.
as a huge opportunity to sell more kit.
They do. And in fact, they're like, we're being rescued
Yeah,
because
exactly.
they didn't win the hyperscale sweepstakes,
Yeah.
unfortunately. Sorry, you didn't win. And so it gives them a second chance. And we have to give credit to Jensen on this one, because Jensen's the one who started talking about the idea of an AI factory initially. And you mentioned it. You might have my assembly line here in this real factory, and next door in my data center is my AI factory powering the actual, which also goes back to the IoT stuff, maybe calling it physical AI, or that connectivity to the real world.
Well,
That's
yeah, it is the edge. I mean, it is the data from the edge, which never goes into the public domain. And
right.
from a security point of view,
Yeah,
massively important, given the alternative is perhaps to train the model, which then trains your competitors.
absolutely. And so no doubt we survey all these big companies and we're getting data that, is it a full blown tidal wave yet? No. But they're all testing it out. They're all trying it out. And then, like all the vendors I described and others, they're all working with customers, and they actually come back with case studies, and they have actual customers who are doing this. Also, there's value in these small language models too. There's this notion that maybe it's not going to be this super powered giant know-it-all LLM. There's a lot of thinking that can be finely tuned in different domains, different expertise, and having small language models that seem to work really well.
And again, we're all getting our information so rapidly from different sources and podcasts and newsletters and whatever. But yeah, what you just said there was a really interesting one. I don't know what it was in. It was in I think a newsletter I subscribed to. It talks about the difference between the US approach and the Chinese approach to AI. And of course, it was about a year ago when that new Chinese LLM came out that was like 20, 30 times cheaper, and they seem to be deep seek, thank you.
Yes.
And
Yes.
it's like, oh my God. And they published all their data and they've
Right.
done it with far less compute. And that shocked everybody. And then, but recently, what people are saying is that China's approach is actually different. It's along the lines of what you just said. This report was saying that most of the innovation around AI is in vertical niches rather than general purpose horizontal LLM and
Right.
agents and the whole stack.
Yeah.
And the race to AGI. They're actually creating industry vertical versions of it. Now, whether it's just the way it's developing or whether or not you wouldn't put it past the Chinese government to have an overall, 20, 30
Sure.
year plan on this. They're
Of course. That's the way they
very,
operate.
very good at that, like
Yeah.
they did with EVs. But anyway, yeah, they are actually optimizing AI, not as general purpose LLMs and general purpose agents and capabilities, but in terms of by business process and by industry vertical.
Right.
So that's an interesting way, because as the race for the LLMs, and people talk about, well, humanity's last exam and all these benchmarks. But the fact is, it's a game of leapfrog, and
It
eventually
is.
everything's just going to even out. I mean, the differences are going to be so minute as to most people say, I don't care.
You're going to ask a question, and a Cisco router is going to send you right to the proper LLM that has the right data.
Yeah, so it'll be abstracted and you won't see it. But then the idea that how will they differentiate? And it almost like application software, it will become vertical and it will
Right.
become horizontal by business process, not just by generic. And talking of application software, again, in your role as an IDC, actually, I never did ask you your exact title. I did say the phrase fancy
Yeah.
schmancy. What did,
It's
are you
not that fancy. I'm a research director.
Oh, well, that sounds pretty good to me. I'm
It's
impressed,
okay.
so that's okay.
It's okay.
But in your role as research director, IDC, what's going to happen to the application software business? And let me just lay the table on that one. So, certainly when I was, I used to be based in Germany and working for HP many, many years ago, and that was when the emergence of SAP. I remember I went to Waldorf
Oh, yes.
when it was a small building. It's like the Walmart
Mhm.
corporate headquarters. I've been there, Bentonville,
Right.
tiny building full of terrified salesmen. But I went to Waldorf, and it was just a building with cows in a field behind and
Yes.
Paso Platno with a vision. And you thought, oh, this German company will never slay the American corporate software companies. And guess what?
Guess what?
They
I did.
did. So, and now, do you think something, I mean, if you listen to a company like ServiceNow,
Hmm.
which people don't put in the big six, big seven, but actually their focus is very much on agents. I mean, they
Yes.
started off in the ITSM, the IT service management space, and
Mhm.
now they're doing these agents all about, automate your HR with agents. They're running
Right.
adverts where the agent proposes the answer and the human says yes,
Mhm.
no, modify.
Yes.
So that raises two questions to try and join the dots here. One is, what is do you believe is the future of enterprise software? Is there going to be a similar type significant disruption of the enterprise software space by companies creating AI enabled agents? And then after that, we'll get on to so what happens when the new graduates come out and their jobs come out of
Right.
university and their jobs get done by agents? But
Right.
let's park that one to the end. What's going to
Okay.
happen in the enterprise software, the big enterprise software players? Now, I know Oracle racing
Mhm.
to
They
stay
are.
relevant.
Yes. They were building Stargate data center
There you go.
near my birthplace of Abilene, Texas, out in West Texas, near all the oil fields in the Permian Basin, because
There you
that's
go.
where they can get cheap energy, right?
Cheap energy. Yeah, we
Which
haven't
is
even
all
touched on that.
that's always been a factor with these data centers,
Yeah.
close to hydropower, close to
Hydro, yeah. Places where the sun shines.
that's right.
And we're
Absolutely.
screwed here, although it does rain a lot, certainly at the moment.
You know, it's
Yes.
too easy for me to jump on this Gentic AI bandwagon because I remember the summer before last, in the course of 1 week, all of a sudden, every event I went to, the CEOs of all these big tech companies,
Said the word
it's
agentic.
they just started saying Gentic, agentic,
Yeah.
agentic. They didn't even know what they were saying, probably. And I've seen the service now. It's good to see Idris Elba doing the service
Yes.
now, and
Professor Idris. Yeah.
I love him. And then I see Matthew McConaughey doing the ones for Salesforce.com for their agent force. And I think what they're doing with the adverts, it's okay to, like anything, when you want to invent something, you have it in your mind, you say it out loud, maybe you write it down. You haven't really created it yet. And I think they're creating adverts to say, this is what we think, this is the possibility. I don't believe for a second that any of them have fleets of agents doing all this stuff, because I've been playing with this stuff too. It's still early days
Yeah.
in that space. Now, there's that notion, are agents going to replace apps and application software?
Yes, that's what I'm getting at.
That absolutely. I think it'll be a combination, because don't forget, folks, we've had agents for a long time. You could call that a daemon. You could call that an NT service. You could have called that a cron job kicking off a script, because agents kind of are invisible software. They're running in the background. They
Yeah.
usually are in a loop.
Yeah.
And in the past, we've had them, and they're deterministic. They're using branching logic, if this and that. They have a task to do. And now we're using agents, and they're going to use that MCP protocol, and they're going to talk to an LLM nearby, and they have instructions, and they're going to carry things out for you. And that, at least that's the thinking. That's the goal. There's the notion of, I'm going to give them a task. And I have friends who are doing this, and they're doing a bunch of agents to go take on tasks, and they're having success with it. There's also the notion of autonomous agents that'll
Yeah.
just kind of be on
They'll
their
learn
own.
from each other and they'll replicate.
Right. Right. We
Yeah.
know how we've seen that movie before.
Yeah. That's
And so, but that being said, you always have to bring it back to reality. I forgot who it was, a friend of mine from Microsoft. He goes, but you know what? Sometimes just clicking a button is a lot more efficient than having an agent do all this back and
talk to
forth.
each other, and then especially I've been playing a lot with AI, and not just in preparation for the new spin of the podcast, but just in general because I'm so fascinated by it. And what people don't say very often is that sometimes chatting to either an agent or just something like ChatGPT.
Mm-hmm.
If you remember Faulty Towers and Manuel, the waiter from Barcelona, and Basil Fawlty used to hit him on the head all the time with a tray, and when he didn't understand stuff, he'd go, "K, K." Honestly, sometimes when you ask LLM to do something, I just feel like I'm talking to Manuel.
You're talking to Manuel.
And especially, it seems especially weak in terms of creating a spreadsheet or a PowerPoint.
Mm-hmm.
They don't seem to be able to do that.
No,
Um,
no,
but,
that's a good.
they are absolutely magnificent at many other things, all of which brings us back to the last question and the big one.
Yes.
And that is that if you assume, with everything going at breakneck speed and all these companies competing, not just the 6, 7 companies that I was going to say horsemen of the apocalypse, but
Six,
I'm not going
seven.
to call them that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. No, yeah. That's it. I shouldn't say it for any of our younger audience. They will probably be screaming six,
We
seven.
pulled in the younger audience right at that moment when
Do
you
you think
said
we're
six,
cool
seven.
enough to do that? I don't think so, Rob.
You're that cool.
But probably most people listening to this saying, "What on earth are they talking about?" when they think so. But anyway, if you assume that the breakneck speed of everything, it's getting better at about 40% a year. So, as
Mm-hmm.
I said, imagine in a year's time, we'll think, well, that was quaint what we said a year ago.
Right.
But one thing that has definitely happened and is going to definitely happen even more is the work increasingly is going to be done, whether it's by agents or just people using LLMs and requiring less people,
Mm-hmm.
is that work is going to be done. I saw this week Stanford produced a study based on US payroll data, which said that in the last, well, this was data as of April, so it's a little bit out of date already, being bigger than this. But it said as of April, back to April 24, 13.13% of the jobs that are now less jobs have been hired based on US payroll data, which is a pretty accurate source of.
Sure.
And people bandy around the fact that 40% of graduates are unemployed for at least a year. So I don't want to particularly ask you about just the generic issue of hiring graduates, but
Mm-hmm.
if the model, coming back to your concept of the enterprise brain, which I like, somebody needs to look at the output from the brain and say, in my experience, as you said earlier, that's a good idea, but it won't work. I know the model thinks this, but in my
Sure.
experience, just don't go there.
Sure.
But if you're not hiring the younger people to get that experience,
Mm-hmm.
then does mean that the experience gradually retires and disappears from the company. So
It
you
could.
actually, although you have an enterprise brain, you actually
Right.
become less competitive rather than more.
Where does AI get its knowledge from? It gets it from people and things, right?
Yeah.
And if that spigot dries up, that water of knowledge stops flowing, then you're right. It will become out of date. It's early days.
Is it?
And I've talked about it. There's the abundance people over here,
Yeah.
and then there's the doom and gloom people
Yeah.
over here. Is
Yeah.
it gonna? I don't know which sides. No doubt about it. You've seen those numbers. I've seen numbers. I've spent most of my career at Microsoft, and the last 2 to 3 years,
They've
I've
laid
just
off
seen
huge numbers of people.
avalanche of layoffs. I know lots of these people. They're the smartest people in the world that I know. And not only did they get laid off, they can't find a job to save their
Yeah.
life. And
Yeah.
it terrifies me. And so that's real. And I know the abundance people are like, oh, don't look at that man behind the curtain of,
Yeah.
but it really is happening. And, I think, you and I listen to, like at Peter Diamandis or whatever.
Peter's the cheerleader
He's
for
the
the
cheerleader of
abundance.
abundance, but his
Yeah.
latest thing, he goes, you know what? They did a survey and they're seeing most of the people in the world are terrified, as it turns out. And there is that concern that even if we do get to abundance, there may be an interim period of a number of years that's going to be a rough road.
I think that's the point, Rob. Yeah. And I know we should probably try and bring this to a close because this could become like a Stephen Bartlett's 2 hours 20. We're not sure. But to your point about, I think, yeah, my view, and this is what we want actually with this new format of the podcast,
Mm-hmm.
is more of a debate. So this is a
Yeah.
great, great opening one. But yeah, my view is that we're, as they say in the London Underground, we're in the mind the gap phase
Mm-hmm.
because the abundance cheerleaders say a world of abundance,
Mm-hmm.
everything is productive, the cost of goods falls I mean, it's the same as what happened when we outsourced to China. The cost of goods did fall, but we actually
Sure.
at the same time got rid of a lot of the middle manager jobs.
Right.
So a lot of people ended up being employed, not being able to buy things that were
That's
cheaper.
like,
A world of abundance, and there will always be, and they say, well, there was always a new job. They go back to the invention of the spinning jenny, which is part of the
yes.
Industrial
Yes.
Revolution, and then mechanical shovels got rid of people who dug holes. But there was always more work. There was
That's
always the
right.
economy grew. There was always more jobs. Now, if you listen to Elon Musk, he says that the physical work, don't think that's immune because of these billions of
Yeah.
Android robots, the biggest product in history, as he called it the other week. And we'll see. I'm skeptical on the
They are all salesmen
robot. They
for
are
their
all
companies.
salesmen, including the robot. I'm skeptical on everyone will have a robot. But
Right.
he even said, well, they'll monitor people so we won't need as many prisons because the robots will make sure you're behaving. I mean, I
Oh,
think
yeah.
that's
Wow.
definitely sniffing some bad stuff.
Yes.
But I think the problem will be, yes, ultimately there will be new types of jobs, as there always has been. But as you correctly pinpointed, maybe this is a subject for another podcast.
Yeah.
It's the gap.
It's the gap.
What we're
I
seeing
think,
is the effect now of the lower level, low hanging fruit
right.
being
Right.
automated, if you like. But we don't see the new jobs yet because we haven't worked
Yeah.
out what agents are going to do. So
Yeah.
there's a 2, 3 year
There's a
period that we're
gap.
going into. And that's what we're seeing with
Yeah.
graduates, for example.
Absolutely. And it's not just the graduates. All the talk track in media on the television has been, oh, yeah, it's hurting graduates. And it is. But my experience is I'm also seeing older people who are really smart also losing their jobs as well. And so that's real. And I see it. It's not a fantasy.
True.
You
It'll
know,
be harder for them to get a job.
it will be harder because, there's that ageism thing that always
Yeah.
plays in, and they're being paid higher salaries.
Yeah.
Well, everyone loves to talk about the different industrial revolutions that we've gone through. And we say, yeah, it's a little painful, but then it creates more jobs and it's always gotten better. I think the difference is each industrial revolution just took care of one thing, one task that it automated, then, like steam, or electricity or whatever. The problem here, and so you would upskill for whatever your job that got replaced. I'm going to upskill and go up the stack, whatever that means, to do this thing. The problem with AI is it's exponential and it's so fast that
Yeah.
when you try to go upskill to this next job,
It's going to overtake you.
it's going to
It's
overtake you next week.
and the maths, and that's where you have to say Peter Diamandis is a good communicator because the human brain has a problem with visualizing an exponential trend. We can all visualize a linear trend.
Yes.
It's like, here's that famous example where he says, like, if you take 16 steps and your steps are a yard each, then you end up 16 yards away. If you take 16 exponential steps, then you circumnavigate the world a certain number of times.
Right.
But with AI, I mean, it's at least three, depending on the benchmark, it's between 3 and 6 times better per year. And so there is no way you can outrace it.
So I think this calls into, I think the bigger discussions will have to be governmental policies are going to have to come in place because how people behave differently when they're put into stressful
Well, you
situations.
get social unrest.
Social unrest. Absolutely. We've seen it throughout history.
Yeah.
When we start to get to 10% unemployment, 20% unemployment, 30, pretty soon you'll have enough people that you think about the pitchforks and torches.
Yeah.
We're going to burn society to the ground. I know that sounds crazy and extreme.
But a lot of people are talking about that. And,
yeah,
as again, I have to give a nod to the Bartlett podcast I saw because I'm shamelessly stealing from it. But the guy he interviewed said, we're all getting wound up about immigrants in our countries, but no one's getting wound up around the AI.
Just wait. Right.
A million bots are coming in.
Yes,
that all have Nobel Prize level.
That's right.
Skills.
They're all PhD
and no
level.
one's asking about that.
I don't want
to end the pod on a.
The trades will help you for a while. Young people, go back to the trades. Go be a welder. Go be an electrician. Be a plumber. Things like that. We still need to build things. It doesn't mean that's.
I got my haircut yesterday. I hope that if you can see it,
it's fabulous
on YouTube. Thank you, especially for the compliment. But I was saying to him, you're the last person that I think is going to be replaced. I'm not going to get one of Elon's robots to
So remember the other saying, the future is here, but it's not evenly
unevenly
distributed.
distributed.
And so you and I and a few others know the bleeding edge of that. But if you walk around your city or your
Oh
town
God,
where you
in
live,
most people
everyone's living their lives and they haven't been
getting on with it,
affected at
yeah.
all.
And actually, that is a great way to finish, isn't it? Because
Yeah.
that's why we are doing what we are doing. We giving up our time. This pod was always initially it was about educating people on the power and the opportunity of IoT, and it became very successful. Now there is a power and the opportunity of IoT to train AI. There's between 50 and 100 times more data around things than there is around data that's been scraped from the internet. And your point about behind the firewall, private, the enterprise brain is all going to be happening. And it is the next big thing. And if you're in IoT, that's actually fantastic career prospects and career employment. We can't solve everything or even talk about everything. But the areas of the implications and societal political implications of this are the areas we have to deal with at the same time, and the necessary regulation. And I probably just described there another 5 podcast episodes.
Podcasts.
Yeah.
Well done, you. Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely. But I'm hopeful.
We've got to address this.
I'm hopeful for our IoT friends that they've gotten another parallel lease on life.
This is their moment. I mean,
this is their moment.
Without exaggeration. I mean, it is the next big wave will be driven by the data of things behind the firewall, private, and the people who are going to get it are the people who work in IoT. And
so you think about doing a normal IoT project. I've got my devices. I'm sending telemetry over some kind of connectivity, cellular from your company. And then I'm going to land in my edge. I might hop over to a big platform somewhere else. And then I'm doing some kind of analytics, or it's going into a database. Well, now it's going to go into a vector database that AI uses. And then it's instantly more easily retrievable by people and bots and everything in a way that we've never been able to do before. Instead of select star on the SQL database to find out what's going on for the, we're going to have our IoT data is so much more empowered now. And so that's exciting. And so you're right. I think the sky's the limit now for IoT these days. It's definitely got a new lease on life. We've gotten out of that trough of disillusionment.
Yes.
And we're skyrocketing.
Well, that's a very positive ending and a great first episode for the new theme. So as always, Rob, you and I could and have talked for hours in the past. And maybe at some point I'll invite you back again and we'll revisit this and some of those big issues that we sort of floated towards the end.
Sure.
Because they are not going to go away.
That's for sure.
But listen, let's end it there. Thanks again for being the guest. Thanks for all the amusing stories. We covered everything from submarines to haircuts. So that was a first.
That is a first. Good luck finding another pod where you're going to get that kind of knowledge and entertainment. Right.
So Rob, thanks for being my guest on the new, and I have to make sure I say it right, IoT and AI Leaders podcast. Guest number 1 on the new podcast. Thank you.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thanks so much for having me. This has been great.
Yeah, great fun. Thanks.